So I'm very passionate, as you know, each week about our speakers, and I truly am. It's not something that I'm putting on for the session. I love the work that we're hearing about, and to hear in a very candid manner about why research is being conducted, the joys, the trials, the tribulations, and as you've heard, different motivations, different experiences, different time frames, perspectives, and outcomes of that endeavor. This week, I am excited for us to hear from our esteemed panelists about their work as it relates to urban sustainability, and in particular, parks. A passion that I have and have had my entire life. I grew up next to Regent's Park and walking my dogs in the morning with the elephants at London Zoo. So I had a very warped experience of what parks should be and thought that everybody got the opportunity to walk their dogs with an elephant. Much to my chagrin, having moved from where I had the opportunity to grow up, realized that my access to green spaces was a privilege, rarefied, reflective of a whole bunch of things, and not least of which being reflective of the city that I grew up in, London, which as a result of how it developed itself, has green spaces absolutely everywhere. London itself is a city that grew out of villages merging, and so there are massive parks across the city. These were former hunting grounds that then went over to become parks. Today, we're going to have the opportunity to hear from our colleagues, some alums, and others who are friends of the Environmental Science and Policy Program and Sustainability Management Program about their work as it relates to urban green spaces and urban parks. To some people, an urban park is a beautification effort. It makes our cities more aesthetically pleasing. To others, a green space and a park is a respite from the urban jungle. And to some, and especially as we sort of come off the heels of the pandemic, where access to outside spaces, especially to urban dwellers, were vital, and a considerable amount of research that had been developed not just prior to, but certainly after the pandemic, vital for not only well-being, but for mental and physical health. And as we know to be true, and as we know from the research that many of you doing either in sustainability management or environmental science and policy, all of our urban environments globally, all environments are heating. And urban environments in particular are suffering from urban heat island effect and have every reason to believe that these locales are going to get warmer as climate change and the trends continue. So what is an urban park today? What is the research that is conducted across the myriad of parks in New York City? Obviously, we're very lucky to be sandwiched between Riverside Park here, Morningside Park that was originally designed by Olmsted, Central Park just a few blocks away, also designed by Olmsted, and other parks across the city that have different sizes, obviously different ecosystems, some being close to bodies of water, others not. But what are they telling us? What is it and how is it research is conducted in the parks? Let me waste no time in the introductions. Novem herself is both a serious and a senior scientist at New York City Parks. She leads a team of scientists who are tasked with monitoring and assessing New York City's parks, their natural resources, their ecosystem services. She advises on natural resource protection and conservation and is using the research and data to inform natural resource management. She's part of the New York City Urban Field Station, which is a partnership between the New York City Parks and the United States Department of Agriculture, specifically the Forest Service. She is also involved in the Natural Area Conservancy, a New York City-based nonprofit that focuses on knowledge and co-production across different disciplines and sectors and bridging the gap between science and implementation. Finally, but not least, we will be hearing from Michelle Mueller Gamez, who is Sustainability and Climate Research Manager at the Central Park Conservancy. Separate and apart from the Parks Department, Michelle is a climate researcher, a writer, and a strategist with expertise in infrastructure and the built environment and nature-based solutions. At the Central Park Conservancy, she leads on how the changing climate impacts landscapes and how to improve ecosystem services to drive action. She's committed to fostering thriving environments for people and nature and holds a master's in urban planning and environmental policy and planning from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So the key topics that you have heard and that we will be hearing about are obviously parks and green spaces, urban climate heroes, of which you are considered among, and the research in municipal governments and public-private partnerships. So with that said, thank you all so much for being here, and let me invite you to kick off, please.
All right, so thank you all for having me here today. I'll be talking about how we care for New York City's natural areas using research and more. I like to start with my story. So I was born in Hong Kong, and I grew up in Bangkok, and I've been interested in environmental issues since I was inspired by my fifth grade teacher, that's me in fifth grade, who talked about water and air pollution. And then I moved to the US for college and ended up taking an intro to ecology class and fell in love with field work. And so after college, I worked in an ecology lab and ended up staying there to do my PhD in climate change effects on soils. So that's me collecting a soil core in an inch of snow in Boston. So I'm a soil biogeochemist, by training. Sorry, I'm touching my mic. Anyway, but halfway through grad school, I sort of realized the huge divide between academic research and what was actually happening on the ground in terms of climate change. And so I actually looked for jobs outside of academia and ended up in New York City in 2012. And I found a job at New York City Parks, first as the lab manager of the New York City Urban Field Station, then promoted to senior scientist, and actually I'm now director of research and monitoring, so that's my new title. And this is essentially my dream job. So I get to track, guide, and conduct research and monitoring that directly affects how we care for natural areas in the city. On good days, I get to kayak out to the marshes near JFK Airport. There are wetlands near JFK where we monitor, this is called a diamondback terrapin. It is a state-listed rare species that somehow is able to survive in New York City. And so if anybody says there's no wildlife except for rats and pigeons and raccoons, they know nothing. So I can tell you about all the amazing wildlife that we have here, one of them being the diamondback terrapin. So yeah. And so as Shannon talked about, our division, Environment and Planning, has a huge portfolio, and I sit within the unit that manages natural areas. We're called the Natural Resources Group. And this group actually has a long history of working with scientists and naturalists in-house and externally to do data-driven natural resources management that dates back to the 1980s. So that's a photo of the original NRG crew, like 15 people in a basement. And now we're like a group of 200 or so staff. So we've really grown since then. And it's just like a snapshot of all the different projects that we have across all the boroughs. We do stewardship events with volunteers. We did a freshwater ecological assessment this summer. To the left is salt marsh sparrow, another rare species that also exists in the wetlands of New York. And then we also have a fish passage for an eel ladder near the Bronx Zoo as well, where we're seeing alewife, glass eels. They're like that river is a really important habitat for them and breeding ground as well. And so before I worked for parks, I actually didn't realize that there were forest, wetlands, and grasslands in nearly every borough. But there are, in fact, about 22,000 acres, as Shannon mentioned. And the city manages about 12,000 acres, while the rest of it is managed by state and federal government. Now, managing all of this land with less than 1% of the city's budget is a huge task, and the only way to really do it is through collaborations. And so I'm part of the New York City Urban Field Station, and it's a partnership between the Forest Service and the Natural Areas Conservancy. And it's both sort of a network, but also a physical space where my desk is literally. And all of the research is conducted with specific management questions and needs in mind, as you can tell from our mission statement there. So how do we prioritize what we want to monitor and do research on? So in 2016, when I started my role as senior scientist, one of the first things I did was just talk to everybody, all the senior staff in the division, and ask them, what sort of research are you interested in or already doing? And, how can I help you? And so with their help, I organized them into sort of 3 major buckets. The first sort of category of questions are condition and assessment questions. So what is the health and vulnerabilities of all these places that we're managing? So this is just a kind of a very quick snapshot of all of the projects that I or people on my team have led that are climate change and ecosystem service related. There's a whole bunch of other things on all sorts of other categories, rare species management, let's see, we've also done some interesting work on mosquitoes and health, and but these are just the climate change and ecosystem service related ones. So we have a forest management framework that details where the healthiest forests are, where the degraded ones are, and what our proposed solutions to that are, and a budget kind of for how we can get that work done. Similarly with the wetlands management framework. And then we also just published a paper on over a decade of tidal marsh monitoring to see whether our tidal marshes are keeping up with sea level rise. The next category is adaptive management, to see whether our past, current, or future designs or interventions are successful and if they have any unintended consequences. So one example is our rapid site assessment. This is how we go back to forests that we've assessed and track whether they are, meeting our goals of a fuller canopy, greater species diversity, wildlife habitat. And then we also have a similar protocol for wetland restorations as well, called environmental compliance monitoring, where we look at places where we've restored the wetlands and see whether we have some, how healthy the system is. And then the last category of monitoring questions and research questions are sort of policy, programming, communications related, to see whether our public-facing programs are doing what we are intending for them to do, and how can they help us advocate for our work more effectively. So we did a citywide ecosystem service report on all the trees in New York City, and we call it the iTree report because we used a tool that was developed by the USDA Forest Service called iTree, which has been used in many cities across the country, actually. And then we also did a citywide social assessment where we looked at park usage and how people use, value, and perceive parks, that I'll talk about a little bit more. Let's see, I think that's all I have on this slide. But in addition to sort of most of the biophysical research that I've talked about that informs our work, there's also a category of research that I'm sort of moving in this direction now, which is called biocultural stewardship research. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with this term or heard of it before. Oh, great, that's awesome, yeah. So I was introduced to this area of research in 2017, and this was when our Forest Service colleagues organized an exchange with their Hawaiian colleagues who had worked with Native Hawaiian researchers for a while now. And so when the Hawaiian colleagues came to New York City, one of them is a Native Hawaiian master teacher called Kakuhi, who developed Halau Ohia. It's a professional development program for conservation practitioners that's rooted in Native Hawaiian worldviews and practices. And the training is built around art and storytelling and bringing your full self to your work. So I think there was a question that I got, like, how do you incorporate art into your work? And she taught us and gave us some examples of how we do that. And so for me, this workshop was really transformational professionally and personally for many reasons. For one thing, like my science has shifted a lot from soils to now biocultural stewardship. And but I had a very my scientific training was very, very traditional. I was taught to write, present, speak in the third person for most of my professional life.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. Science was supposed to be objective, and this workshop kind of helped me see the ways that I can bring my multiple identities into my work, but also make space for the people I work with to do the same. And this workshop has also given me a lot of helpful language and frameworks to describe kind of the value of doing that, and also uncovering invisible labor, which happens a lot in the care world. Like when you're caring for the environment, caring for children, caring for elderly, all sorts of care work is undervalued in our society. And that is a really kind of important viewpoint that I've sort of learned and seeing everywhere now that I've done this. So anyway, that's really long. But Kekuhi also gave us some homework after the workshop. She encouraged us to organize within our own community a practice and kind of get to know the other stewards in our community. And so we started something called the stewardship salons that we're still doing to this very day, trying to learn from the rich cultural diversity in New York City and meet people where they are, so inviting kind of environmental justice organizations and learning what they're doing on the ground. So, and also reaching out to religious organizations and finding out what environmental programs they have as well. And so, and so then this way we can start, I sent out a paper on co-creation too, but this is how we weave in co-creation into our everyday kind of work. So when we have a grant proposal that's come out that sort of involves a community partner, we've already got that list of people that we already kind of have connected with, know what their needs are, and it makes the grant writing easier. Or when we're developing methods around things, we've already got our contacts in the community. Or when we're, we can start engaging people earlier in the process and not just wait until after the paper is published and then send it to them and say, look what we found. Because it's so important to account for the existing kind of social, cultural context of the spaces we're trying to improve and critically ask ourselves, who are we doing these improvements for? Did we just assume that these interventions are going to benefit the community? Or did we actually take the time to ask them first? So anyway, that was a long spiel about this slide. But then I'm also wanted to kind of talk a little bit, dig into a bit about, as researchers, we also have to recognize the importance of qualitative data and not only quantitative data. So for example, this is some data that we collected from the social assessment. So the social assessment was where we counted people doing different activities in the park, the signs they left behind in case we just didn't encounter someone, and also interviews with park visitors. That was randomized. So we randomized and interviewed every third person we encountered so that we're not just biasing towards certain groups. And what we found is that when we focus on the number of people who visit an area as our metric, so that's the map on the left, if you always evaluate how valuable a park is based on the number of people who visit it, the landscaped areas, which are the darker colors, the playgrounds, will always be the ones that have more visitation. And your woods, your wetlands, your natural areas will always be the lighter color. And so if you use that metric as your way of saying how valuable a place is, it's not gonna pick up natural areas. But if you look at the map on the right, that's out of all the people that we interviewed, these are the number of people that said they felt like they could get away, they could take a break, they felt at peace. The darker colors are the natural areas where more people responded that they felt that way. And so this is really important. the quality of the experience that you're getting at the park is also a really important piece of data to capture. And it provides us with data it's complementary to the quantitative data as well. So that's sort of my case for taking the time to collect that qualitative data. And then the papers that I share sort of dig into the importance of accounting for a local context and knowledge whenever you're designing your research question or designing your project. So like in both of those, we were trying to involve all the important stakeholders we could in informing the monitoring framework, which is the one on the top. So now that is the statewide shoreline monitoring framework that was developed. That's what the paper described. And it's actually being implemented in a couple of sites in New York City and New York State. And then the one on the bottom is about the social assessment, which I mentioned earlier, which is where you started the Van Cortlandt graph. We're adapting that method to now use in parks before we go in and do a restoration or a park improvement. We do the social assessment first. And then we understand what that current use is, and then we sort of can design our forest, wetland, grassland restoration with that in mind. Because what ended up happening is, I know some people ask, how, doesn't it take more time to include the community? And then you have to slow down your project and all that stuff. So one example and justification I can give for that is, so we restore wetlands all the time, and a lot of the time we put up goose fencing to prevent geese from eating all of the vegetation that we just planted. At one of the parks where we did that, there was actually a group of people that fished in that particular park. And they just continually cut our fence over and over again. And we had to keep on replacing it over and over and over again until we sort of talked to them and asked them, which path do you go to go fish? Maybe we can avoid putting the fence there. And so we don't have to waste our time keeping on fixing the fence. And they were like, sure, yeah, if you just leave this way open, we'll just, we'll use that path, and then the rest of the marsh will be okay. And we did that, and it worked. And now we know the people who fish in that area, and we can keep our wetland in place. And I know that some people also mentioned, but what if the fish are really toxic and they shouldn't be fishing in the first place? That is also something we're working on with community partners. We're writing a grant right now to do that. So that is how you incorporate local context in your work, and that's how you make time for it, because it sort of saves you the effort of having to resolve your problem over and over and over again. So these are just sort of some parting thoughts. When you're designing your research question, who are you involving to formulate your research question? Do you understand the needs of your community that you're hoping to serve, past, present, and future? Because survey fatigue is real. Survey fatigue, I don't know if you guys have learned that idea yet, right, of overburdened communities. That is real. And then who is benefiting from your research and who might be harmed from it? And basically, the big picture, how does your research question exist in the context of all in which we live and what became before it? So yeah, that's my thoughts. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
No, I know we only have 10 more minutes
Oh,
with
sorry.
Novem, so I don't know if you want to have a conversation with her first.
Unfortunately, Novem needs to leave at 5.
I can leave at 5:15. Yeah, I left
So
it.
Novem will leave at 5:15. But in order to make sure that you have an opportunity to speak with her and she with you, and in tradition with our course, I feel this semester, despite what we had articulated by way of the run of show, we're going to change it. So, Ovum, so what questions do you have for Ovum and her research and the work that she's doing?
We have a mic coming around. So
Sorry, I put you on the spot. It's okay. Yeah, thanks for watching it tonight. I didn't realize there was harm happening.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I had a couple of questions. One predominantly on mangroves and how mangroves, do you see mangroves really helping New York City generally with regards to like sea level rising, because that's something generally is used across the board in cities that have a potential of higher sea levels. So that was the first question.
Sorry, I missed the mangroves?
Mangroves.
Mangroves.
Mangroves. Oh, I don't think we're the right climate for mangroves at the moment, as far as I know.
At the
moment. Yeah. I mean, we'll see. We'll see what happens. Yeah.
Semester's going to be about mangroves.
Right.
We'll add that to the list.
Yeah. So yeah, it is getting warmer, but I think like there are sorts of other considerations with mangroves that I think. So yes, in Thailand, yes, mangroves are a great species, but I think local context is important. And so in the marshes of New York City, it's mostly Spartina that we plant. So Spartina alterniflora is the main kind of marsh grass that we plant. We do plant maritime forest species as well. I don't know, Baccharis, Prunus maritima, all of those other species. We try to be really kind of like thoughtful about picking species that have been evolved to survive in the climate, of New York City. And because, if your plants die, then you have no, then it doesn't succeed. So we do have a native species planting guide that we use for all of the restorations that we do in natural areas that I could share with the professor and the TAs, so you guys can have it too. Yeah.
Thank you so much for today. I have a question regarding adaptive management that you mentioned about RSA, which is rapid site assessment.
Oh yeah.
Has it been adapted by other geographies or in a broader global context as well, besides New York?
So, the backstory for the social assessment is that it was actually originally used at the national parks. So the Forest Service colleagues that developed the protocol actually took from their national forest colleagues kind of this protocol and adapted it for the city. And so I think it's sort of like, yeah, of course, we could probably adapt it for other contexts as well. We haven't had the chance to work with other folks to do that yet, but I think it is a flexible enough protocol that there is the potential to sort of adapt. I mean, we've adapted it for our restoration projects too, so it's like the great thing about it is, I mean, it's a fast interview. There are only, I think, 7 questions in it, and so it only takes people 5 to 10 minutes to answer. But sometimes you encounter that person who will give you their life story, and that's also data. We've tweaked the interview questions around depending on what the thing we're trying to, like what the improvement is exactly that we're making. So, like in one of the wetland parks, we were curious about how people were using the shoreline. So we had a specific question about how are you using the shoreline. For another one where we're doing a bike lane through Casino Park, we asked people basically how comfortable would they feel about the width of the bike lane, being in the middle of the woods, or would they ever, what kind of lighting they would prefer. So I feel like it's possible to do that adaptation. We just haven't gotten around to it yet.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just while we're waiting for the mic, is there particular time frames that you look at to define success of plantings? So if they survive 2 years, 5 years, what is it?
So for forests, we usually have to wait until year 2 to 3 before we kind of go back and say, oh yeah, this did well, this didn't. But then for wetlands, the reason why it's called environmental compliance monitoring is actually the regulatory world for wetlands is very, very strict. And so for every single wetland that we do, we have to apply for a permit from the Army Corps or the Department of Environmental Conservation. And so it's actually mandatory post-restoration monitoring for 5 years. And so we are committed to at least monitoring for 5 years. And sometimes if we can find the grant funding, we will go back. And so we do have data from places that we restored like 10 years ago, 15 years ago as well. So we try to monitor, as best as we can with the resources that we have. But yeah, we try to look at the long-term kind of outcomes. There was also a paper that we did also using a grant looking at a forest restoration from 20 years ago to see how different interventions, so in the early days of restoration, we weren't sure if clearing the non-native plants, clearing and planting, and then clearing, planting, and then maintaining those plots was sort of worth that effort. And that 20-year study basically said, yeah, it is worth it. Yeah, so you should do it if you can. So that's why that's why our forest restorations, we go back to plant some more trees if some of them have died, or plant the understory so that that structural complexity of that forest comes back faster. Or we have volunteers also help us take part in those activities, so then they feel kind of ownership for those spaces, and there's less likely to be vandalism and all of that after the plantings. So yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, so my question is, what advice would you give early career scientists in actually applying your research knowledge into real world situations like parks?
I don't know. I feel like this is not a very interesting or sexy answer, but it's just talking to people. Talk to people often. There's no a lot of this work, doing work that actually benefits the community, involves a lot of relationship and trust building, and so there's just no way to shortcut that. You really just have to kind of talk to people. Is sort of the boring answer. Yeah.
Could I, just knowing that you're going to leave,
Oh yeah.
and I'm going to follow you and stalk you after this conversation, and picking up on what you were asking about equity, how much has your work shifted from maintaining a park as a utility and a service and a resource to communities versus it now being a key resource and utility in addressing public health, cooling? So that's one part of the question. The second being, then, what data are you using? CGIS tools? What data are you using to couple to shift your perspective on what a thriving park looks and feels like in light of what you just mentioned in terms of canopy scores, equity scores, and where you're targeting your investments?
Right. Oof. Okay. So the first question was, how has it shifted in my time at parks? I mean, it's been, I think, when I first started at my division, all of our research questions were very focused on the ecological and the biophysical. And this incorporation of social science research is really in the last kind of 5 years or so into our management. So that's been a nice shift to recognize that there's a huge other body of knowledge out there about how do you engage with people, how do you communicate effectively, how do you design programming in your parks to that serves everybody. So that's been a shift in the knowledge that we're drawing from, and I'm trying to take it another step further to include indigenous knowledge as well. So we're working with some of the Lenape descendant and Lenape organizations in the city to do. We're planning a planting actually with them in Inwood Hill Park. Yes, I know. Yeah,
I'll be there.
Oh, good. Yeah.
So we indigenous species.
Apparently they used to plant groves and groves of beach plums in Inwood Hill Park. So we're trying to kind of plant a grove in Inwood Hill Park.
Is that what the orange area is that's pinned away, right? Pinned up?
I don't know. I think they're constantly marking up things in the park, so I'm not quite sure what all the things are. But yeah, so that's sort of where I'm hoping we can move towards. And then the second question was?
The second was, what data are you using? Are there different, whether it's CGEST, how are you, what data do you need in order to be able to shift your perspective and your research to address the public health and the socioeconomic versus the biological and the ecological exclusively?
I think it depends on the type of project. So CGEST, I actually have a lot of issues with that, with that data set, because for some reason it thinks that, like, I don't know, somewhere ridiculous, like Upper East Side is CGEST. I'm like, that doesn't seem right. Because like it's based on a national data set. And so there's some, you know, when you try to downscale from a national level data set, things can go wrong. So CGEST is actually one that I've submitted some comments back to them about their inaccuracy. We work with the DEC's PIJA data set, so that's the Potential Environmental Justice Area data set. That's a statewide one, so that one is a little bit better. And we work with Department of Health as well, because they seem to have a lot of good data on sort of where, like, if we're looking at respiratory illnesses, they know sort of where the hotspots are. If we're looking at heat-related mortality, they know where those data sets are. So a lot of collaboration with DOH, actually, to get at the EJ kind of like areas, depending on which intervention or which thing we're targeting.
I'm sensitive as well to the segue to public-private partnerships in your work in the Central Park Conservancy.
I guess we can move on. I feel
But are there, just before we, are there questions, issues, comments that you'd like to make about your work and what it is to work with the public? Because I'm sensitive to the fact that you've got to run, and this is a dynamic part of the conversation I think is really, like Central Park wouldn't be the Central Park if we were just relying on the Parks Department. And I don't mean that to ding you, I just mean to your point, tremendous resources, only 1% of the overall budget, one of the most beautiful parks in the country. So, I mean, in terms of anything that you want to tease out about your work together, or either the challenges or the way that it's shifted over time.
Right. I guess one thing sort of like I want to sort of say is like burnout is real. You know, we're all in the environmental sector. We all see things are on fire, sort of like literally sometimes and metaphorically. And one of the best ways that I found to kind of like deal with that is to just remind yourself we're not doing this alone. There are a lot of us working on this issue. And now that I've started like doing this biocultural stewardship work, it's bigger than you think. Like it is bigger than you think. Like a lot of the organizations that we wouldn't think like care about environmental issues, they do actually. It just doesn't, they're not using the same language that we are, and they're not sort of like using the same metrics. But what they're doing is still like really important and valuable. Like one of the things that I learned from my Forest Service colleagues is sort of like that trash bag that someone has like bothered to kind of set aside in an area where there are no other trash cans, that's a sign of stewardship. That's someone who cares about their park enough to pick up their trash, put it in a bag and set it aside, even though they just didn't do the last mile of walking it to the next, to the near trash cans. But it's an issue too. Not every place has like accessible trash cans. So like, sort of like learning to train my eye to see those signs of stewardship and remembering that I'm not alone in doing this work is really important. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah. Okay, let's get through the bunch. You're not going until you answer these questions.
Sure.
Sorry, I'm kidding.
Okay, yeah, no, it's fine, yeah.
Yes, thank you. Hopefully this question makes sense. But in your operationalizing resilience article, I really appreciated how your research kind of talked about the need for the definition of resilience needing to be expanded to include like the inclusion of social benefits and whatnot. So pretty much throughout your research, my question is asking for like the expansion of something that's already been in place, resilience. Do you feel like that's a better approach to garnering support or awareness to, a certain approach to something as opposed to coining a new term for it in order to bring awareness to it?
That's a good question.
Great question.
I think it depends on what audience you're trying to sell that idea to. So I think, it sort of like depends. Is sort of like I know it's not like a straight answer. Like we frame, I feel like the reason why resilience gets so many definitions and stuff, people have found that it's like a useful hook, you know? So some people sort of like kind of take it up, you know, have their own take on it that's separate from anything that has happened before. And some people will build on something existing. For us, I think we wanted to, I think we were doing it in regulatory frameworks, and so we wanted to build on something existing rather than create something new. I can't get into this, but like everybody I work with knows that nature-based solutions are better. Like we just know, but the systems that are in place right now were not designed for those solutions in mind. Like, what we have decided, you know, what the Army Corps has decided long ago was that engineering was the way to solve many of our problems. And so, so we're evaluating a seawall for its hazard mitigation benefits. And we're evaluating a salt marsh for its hazard mitigation benefits. But we're not evaluating the seawall for its biodiversity benefits, but we are still evaluating the like wetlands for their biodiversity benefits. And so like the system is kind of imbalanced to begin with. And so in that particular paper, in that particular context, expanding that existing definition helped us make the case for why actually we should evaluate that seawall based on its biodiversity benefits, you know, because we're expecting the marshes to do that. So, so that's why we went with that approach, but I can't guarantee that that's gonna work every single time. But that was just what worked in that particular context, in that particular system, yeah. So. Oh, wow.
Yeah, no, you got a lot.
Yeah, it's okay.
You may want to change your plans.
Yeah, maybe I'll have to just
I'm
text
kidding.
our sitter. Yeah, I have 5 more minutes, I guess, yeah.
I'll try to keep this pretty
Oh, yeah,
quick.
sure.
This is regarding arts, actually, and you were talking about biocultural stewardship and, you know, having like traditional like Hawaiian dance as part of, you know, understanding how to storytelling, but also meeting the needs of people. I was wondering, because I know many artists that also collaborate with scientists towards solutions and nature-based solutions. Like, if there's like any anecdote or any kind of knowledge you can kind of give us.
I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but also as an outgrowth of the Kakuhi thing, we have an urban field station artist in residence program. So that has been going on for 4 years. So I didn't have time to talk about that too, but I can also. So it's called the Urban Field Station Collaborative Arts Project, or Arts Program, sorry. It's ufsarts.org. So if you wanted to look it up, that's been going on for 4 years now. Started off in New York City, and now it's like a Forest Service-wide program. So there are artists in Baltimore, in Philadelphia, in, oh my gosh, I'm trying to remember all the different cities. Chicago, like there are a bunch of cities now that also have field station artists working with them. And so I worked with a sound artist who recorded underground sounds. We had she put up her recordings in Prospect Park. I don't know if you guys have been to the Nikki Lintz Underground Sound Project. Mm-hmm. I worked with her, took her to all of these natural areas where we do restorations, and she recorded some of those sounds from those areas. So yes, we are trying to work with artists who can communicate our work to a broader audience, an audience that we normally wouldn't be able to reach as scientists. Yeah. Cool.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I feel like I've learned so much already, and we have like another speaker. It's great. So I wanted to ask, thinking about pieces of legislation like Local Law 97, what laws, real or hypothetical, would benefit you in terms of cooperation with the private sector or government support of climate action, bicultural stewardship, etc.?
Oh man.
So many.
I know, right? There's so many. Let's see, They watered down the Clean Water Act so that now waters of the United States has a more narrow definition. So if we can undo that, that would be great. I mean, I could have a whole wish list of things that I wish could change. Like Endangered Species Act, the process for listing species is really onerous. I could go on and on and on. Trying to see what are sort of like the kind of like, biggest bang for your buck.
I think the Clean Water
Act is like a huge one. Yeah, like there's like a really sad study of how many acres of wetland have been lost since they changed the definition of what the waters of the United States are. Because now every single water body has to be connected, I think, in some way to some kind of like bigger water body. And so all of these smaller freshwater wetlands, vernal pools, all of those are no longer protected. And so that single change in the definition had like a huge impact on our ability to protect wetlands in the country. So that's a huge deal, yeah. Yeah. Oh.
Hi, thank you for speaking with us. I was wondering if the framework for evaluating resilience, described in operational learning resilience, has met with success as people adopted it.
So far we've still just been using it kind of within our network. So like, so this is the Harbor Estuary Project, and then CUNY have been using it on a lot of the sites that we're managing. So far it's still pretty limited in terms of the adoption. We're still working on the data infrastructure for storing all that data. I think it's like the grant that we got for it was only for developing the framework. But then there's this whole data infrastructure component, data analysis component that we never got funding for. So we're still trying to piece that together, with like the kind of assortment of funds and other things. So it's still not widely used at the moment, but hopefully one day it will be. Yeah. All right.
Wow.
Thank you so much.
A round of applause.
Oh, gosh. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much.
Yeah,
so very, very much for being here and entertaining our questions. I'm sure
of course.
We will likely have some follow-up. So it's okay to email you.
Yes, of course.
Great.
Yeah, feel free to share my email. I'm happy to answer questions. And I'll send the link to the Native Species Planting Guide and also some of our Urban Field Station artist stuff too.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
All you.
Okay, it's really hard to follow Novem.
It's really hard.
Yeah, and we are zooming in from the whole parks into one park. So I work for Central Park Conservancy, and I guess I'm curious, like, how many of you guys know about conservancies in New York City, or are you familiar with like Riverside Park Conservancy? Okay, so you guys are, we have some nods.
Give us the idiot's guide to conservancies and what does it mean for the New York side?
Yeah, I think just like if we can rewind in our brains back to the 80s, there was a lot of disinvestment in urban areas in the United States, and consequentially a lot of tax resources left the cities, which left a lot of our municipal financing essentially broke, and parks really suffered, I think, from that. And I think Central Park Conservancy was one of the first to actually get established, but the park was built in the 1800s, and then in the 1980s just saw kind of like it wasn't being stewarded, it didn't have a lot of care, it was kind of in disarray. A lot of these historic landmarks and these landscapes were not really accessible to community groups. So I think it's unique in the United States to have a private-public partnership or model, but essentially conservancies sign an agreement with the city and with the Parks Department. We get a small percentage of funding to steward the land, and then we go out and fundraise for capital projects, improvement, and then in the conservancy also like day-to-day operations in Central Park. I know like other conservancies have different models with the Parks Department, but ours is pretty, I think, separate from the Parks Department. And so the organization I work for, we're a nonprofit. We have about 400 employees. Similar to the Parks Department, we have like a capital projects team who does design and construction. We have a huge fundraising team who's working with some of the wealthy, homeowners that live adjacent to the park, but also a lot of the corporations or kind of the midtown business centers whose employees use the park. And then we have, operations employees, and I think one thing that's really been fortunate about our model is we're able to hire people year round. So not doing like seasonal contracts, but we have people who work, in the winter when the season might be lower. And I think that's, a social benefit that we can offer. But we have 40 million visitors that come to Central Park every year. That was from a study before COVID, so I'm sure the number has gone up. And we have, I think a very disproportionate budget compared to the Parks Department per acre, but a budget of about $100 million annually. So it is a lot of money to like steward and take care of Central Park. And despite that, I feel like we still would like to have a higher standard than what we can make. And I guess the other thing I would just emphasize that I think maybe you two aren't allowed to say, but I can say is that, the city, out of our budget, only 1% goes to the Parks Department. And so the amount of work that you two are doing with a very small budget and like stewarding all this land across all the boroughs, and we've talked a lot about equity. Without like funding, I think coming from the city, it's really hard to support those initiatives in other boroughs. And so even though I work for the Conservancy, I understand some of the inequality that comes from this sort of model and kind of this like structure that we're working with. And so I would encourage you guys to all advocate for funding of parks with city budgets where possible. And then my role within the Conservancy is sort of two parts. One is doing, I think I put it here, research for green space and climate advocacy. So, sort of what I just said, but like advocating what the ecosystem services are of these urban parks, how they help us build our resilience against climate change, how they both mitigate through storing carbon and sequestering annually, but also help with like cooling and stormwater retention. So just kind of green spaces as part of the solution. And then another part of my work is more in like sustainable operations and design within the Conservancy. So maybe more of like a traditional sustainability role where I'm measuring our greenhouse gas emissions, looking for pathways to reduce it, looking at our water quality. And I'm a one-woman show. So I think in any nonprofit, it's like people wear multiple hats. And so my day-to-day varies based on like sort of what our priority is. So I didn't put together like very rigorous slides, but this is a paper we collaborated with the Natural Areas Conservancy. So they're a nonprofit that partners with parks and also with us advocating for natural areas as part of the climate solution. And we put out a paper essentially just like providing a baseline for practitioners around the United States to be able to say, like, what are the impacts of climate change on urban nature? What are the mitigation benefits we get? And what are different adaptation pathways? And so I specifically worked on this like stormwater study using an INVEST model out of Stanford. So I don't know, has anybody heard of the INVEST model? It's just a way to measure ecosystem services that they've put together, and it's available online, but you sort of have to do a lot of like data collection and cleaning to run it. And we were just looking at different types of parkland. So you have kind of like open green spaces with trees, or you have natural areas, and how do those ecosystem services like perform against each other? This is not really easy to see, but we talked a little bit about measuring carbon stock, and I think Nova mentioned an iTree study that Parks Department did in 2019. And so we had that data, but the Natural Areas Conservancy has a methodology published online for measuring carbon stock in natural areas that considers dead tree stock as well as living trees. So, you know, like dead trees also store carbon in landscape. So how can we account for that as well? Leaf litter, and then really soil. So something I've been working on in the past year has been applying that model to Central Park beyond our natural areas. So how can we think about our grassland areas and how much carbon they're storing? And how can we maximize that through using things like compost? And this chart on the right is hard to read, but it's essentially our tree species and like how much carbon each species stores throughout the park. And our oaks and elms are really the heavy hitters here. So trying to encourage those. These are just my colleagues collecting soil samples, a map. So sometimes, the science looks like this, just like going out and collecting soil. We also did a study with Natural Areas Conservancy on cooling. They really did like a national-wide study, but we focused, just in Central Park, and we put air temperature sensors underneath trees in our different landscape types, but also on street trees. And I mean, I think we all know that like parks are cooler than the street, but I think just having like a number to be able to point to is helpful. And especially on the hottest day, I think this must have been 2022 or 2023. It was 10 degrees cooler in the woodlands than it was on the street trees. So like, that's huge. I think on a 100-degree day, it can be so much cooler within woodlands. I think, you guys have probably done a lot of research on this too, but like, I think a next step would be like understanding how green spaces like cool buildings adjacent to parkland. And then just like a little bit of some of the work I've done internally. We had not had like a sustainability strategy or plan or goals at the Conservancy. I think like, a lot of conservancies don't have a huge research arm. They don't have I think people just think of like green spaces as being sustainable, but there are opportunities to like reduce our emissions, to really track how much water we're using and have like a comprehensive strategy. And so I've been working on this for like a year and a half, and it should be coming out soon. So look, you'll see it on my website or LinkedIn when it's done. It'll be available. But this is something that I've been working on, and it's really been sort of a traditional sustainability plan. I've been working across business units, like identifying what our priorities are, creating baselines, a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. I'm sure y'all are familiar with these, but measuring the diesel that we use or the gasoline on site, our electricity that we bring in. And then for scope 3, actually like managing waste is a big part of our work. And the toilets, and I don't think people talk about that enough, but we haul a ton of trash offsite to the Department of Sanitation. And also we recycle a lot. Actually, in the past year, we've really focused on our recycling efforts. And we did a waste audit and just like basically looked within our bins, and we were like, okay, our paper is not like clean. We can't really recycle it. So we really focused on metal, plastic, glass. We did a whole training with our employees. We take them to Sims Recycling Center, and just by like doing that in the past year, we've doubled our recycling rate. So I feel like that's like huge. So things like that, like by having these metrics, we can be able to like drive some of those things. And then I've also been working a bit with our capital team. So our design and planning. So anytime anything gets restored, I don't know if you guys have seen like the pool on the north end of the park. There's this like big project, this big construction project. So obviously we want those buildings or that design to be done in the most sustainable way. So we've been trying to measure our embodied carbon, kind of aligning with like New York City and New York State on some of the regulations around that. So like one small project can be as much emissions as like our waste management for the whole year. So it's really kind of can help us prioritize that. Another challenge we have is just an aging tree population. This is just like 5 tree species, but I think a lot of parks in New York City, our trees were planted over 100 years ago. And so in addition to like warmer, wetter temperatures, like our trees are also old. So really thinking about like a strategy for a sustainable forest with a mix of young and mature trees. I think I put this photo here. I think I wanted a second photo next to it. But I think one of the tensions that we were talking about is just like in design, designing for sustainability, we've really come across issues with like historic preservation. The park, is a landmark, has to go through landmark review. It was built in the 1800s, and now we're in the 21st century and we have different challenges, and that like really plays out in the design of the built environment. So like this is a paver. You see pavers like this all over like the city, and we're kind of confined to using these, even though there's like there's suggestions where like, oh, we could use like white reflective paint so that absorbs less heat, or even like tree canopy, and like the extent of shade has become sort of something that's controversial. Like Olmsted's design had kind of like a gradient from going from like dense canopy to like no canopy, or like had these view sheds where you could kind of see the landscape. And so there's sort of like this tension in historic preservation to preserve some of like minimal canopy versus what we know about the ecosystem services. Like we really, in a really warm city, want to be maximizing our tree and canopy cover. So I think those are some, like, I just sit in a lot of conversations and try and like pull research to advocate really for some of these like climate adaptive actions. And then I think I pulled in water just to talk about water a bit. So the park is not like a natural landscape. A lot of the water bodies were designed and in Central Park, and I think this is probably true for Prospect Park and other like designed pools and ponds. They're essentially just fed from the New York City water. And we've had droughts, and so I think like, even though I feel like we're inundated with water, like the potential for drought and stewarding water is also really important in the city. And so we've been working with the Department of Environmental Protection to do this like water recirculation project. So instead of having just like an open faucet into the water bodies, like how can we recirculate that water and not let it flow out into the East River? So this is like a huge capital project. And I think one of the reasons why I also mention it is like some of these environmental sustainability projects are sort of unglamorous and invisible, and they're just like infrastructure projects. And this is like buried underground. It's gonna actually be like a pain to build. People are gonna be upset, but like it will have these big environmental, like it'll improve the quality of the water because we won't be getting like phosphates like put into the water. It will, then improve the habitat. It'll mitigate any like water that we're sending into our infrastructure during storm events. So I think that's a big challenge in like just climate adaptation and research, is like, how do you make these like unsexy, invisible projects exciting to donors and the public? Yeah.
How much of it is dependent upon your donors? And versus, so there's your visitors obviously that are walking through the park. Oh, it's lovely, I've been to Central Park. And visitors, I would assume, include local residents as well. Count. So who are you, whose will do you need to bend to?
Yeah, it's interesting. Definitely we have like a board of like, core constituents that we need to adhere to. And these people are just really wealthy people in New York City. So that, as we were talking about equity, like causes some constraints in ways. But, one thing that's been really actually positive is a lot of like our corporate donors, like JP Morgan's a big donor, or like Macquarie Bank, because they now have like a bigger interest in like equity. Like we've had to shift some of our programming a little bit, especially with like the Harlem Mirror Center, really focused on like serving the Harlem community. So I think that has been like a positive, but we've had to like adjust to it. And then, I guess that would be the big kind of group. I think a lot of nonprofits right now are also struggling because some of these older donors are aging out, and like younger people like we sort of just have less resources than maybe the generation before us and less disposable income, or like, so how do you kind of, that's something we really think about, is like, how do we support like the next generation of civic leadership in our city? That's how our president calls it. I have like 2 more slides. These are biochar bags. We sort of have this problem. Maybe this is a better photo. We have algae in the pool. Have you guys been to the park and like seen how nasty the water is in the summer? Part of this is like the water recirculation issue, but there's just like excess nutrients in the water. And we've been like putting biochar bags, and honestly, I don't understand the science of biochar, but it basically, you might understand it better, but it like uptakes excess nutrients, and we've been piloting this in one pond. And the cool thing is like, it's actually a kind of a zero waste initiative, because we just bring these bags back into our natural areas, and we can like disperse the nutrients in areas that we were trying to like regrow or fertilize. So this is them like in the landscape, but they would be in this pond. And so this is an image from June 13th, 2023. And then this is an image from June 13th, 2024. So you can sort of just see like, actually there are many variables, but we saw some preliminary success with it, but then we did see some algae in the future. So it's just sort of us, sort of experimenting with the quality of the landscape. And that's something I'm really committed to, is just having high quality nature, both for like, I think I deeply care about biodiversity and the life in the landscape, but also so that people can enjoy high quality nature in New York City. Yeah. Okay, I'll stop there.
Just before, one of the things that I, whether intentional or otherwise, but both of you mentioned on more than one occasion, operations research. I think about operations management, and whether it's bathrooms, whether it's litter pickup, or accommodating 41 million visitors on an annual basis. How much do you think about your work in particular as being sort of operational on that front?
Yeah, I think when I first started, I didn't think of it as that way. And then, this is my first time working in an organization that was really service oriented, stewarding a physical space. And now I would say like 90% of it is like, how can we improve what we're doing, and how can we have data that is evidence of like that improvement? So I guess KPIs, but I think it helps advocate for your work. It helps you secure funding. It helps you make decisions, even like us tracking our waste spends and being able to say we've like doubled our recycling rate in a year. Right. I think that, is something that people want to hear.
Okay. So we are at time. Thank you so much for your time, your energy,